to maintain a useful society. So
it is a fully functional, useful society. I want to share something with you guys I found just because this was interesting to me. This isn't really about economics, but it's about the situation we're in today. And I thought this odd because this went, like, it's been around a long time, the board game, but it actually received a big upgrade last year. Microsoft owns it, but it's called the Pandemic board game. Has anyone ever seen this? Has anyone ever seen this? It
looks a little like Melania on the cover.
Right, but here's what's funny is it's been around since 2008. It was written by Matt, somebody, a real famous game writer, but the board game got a huge upgrade in August of 2019. And, telling you, hey, this is a great way, what are you going to do if the whole world got hit with the pandemic? How would you control it? I just thought it was interesting. I didn't know if I'm going to buy it because I think I need to learn what to do when there's a pandemic. Maybe I'll buy it and give it to our government. But
you can also get the 69-page booklet the Obama administration left for the Trump administration.
Oh, the pandemic team. Yeah.
They left a 69-page, guidebook. Here's what to do.
What's interesting, and I don't know, I've been talking about it all day, is Iceland. If anyone takes a look at what they did and how they addressed the situation, but they survived this pandemic very well. They never even closed down the schools. They caught it when the first person got infected. But their testing methods were totally different than anyone else's. They would take people with symptoms and not test them. They would go, well, if you got the flu or COVID, go over here. You get treated, but we're not going to waste our money testing you. What they used their test on were people who had no symptoms. Yeah. And they went out and tested the whole population. They heavily tested per capita more than anyone else in the world. And they contained the situation. They went to strict policies, wear masks, be respectful, distancing, things like that. But they never shut down economically. So I just wanted to share that there are. But here's what they said. They said the minute they detected one person, they followed their pandemic policies.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, they had pandemic policies. Where was ours? So I look at this footprint and I go, this is what people need to follow. These kind of, like Hong Kong, that's a good footprint. They all have pandemic kits that they carry around. And part of the kit, and people don't know this, is the COVID can carry in on your shoe and stay on your floor for 17 hours. And a lot of people aren't aware of that. So part of their kit is sanitizing their shoes.
A lot of what government needs to do is boring stuff like having plans, having stockpiles. It's not as fun as playing politics. And both parties are equally, guilty of preferring politics to the boring but important work of government.
Also, you will not get 80% return on your investment by doing all that stuff. Never.
Well, the thing is I think that, again, it's like you said, it's like financial literacy, right? The greatest gap between poverty and sustainability is financial literacy. And like Nick says, nobody wants to do financial literacy because it's boring. So that's why you still have such a high low income population or poverty, because it's boring. I don't want to learn it. So, but we need to change that mental state of mind. And maybe this is a good reset button. And David, I'm so glad that you said that we live with 19th century education foundation. We need to change that. And we've got a great person to do that right here, Jeff, all the way from the University of Illinois. Hello, Jeff.
How's everybody doing?
Hello.
Hi. Do you know David K. Johnston?
Well, we've followed each other on social media and had a few exchanges over the years, so it's good to see him in person.
Ah, well, good.
What's GIS behind you?
What's that?
It looks like the letters on the banner behind you.
GIES, Gies College of Business.
Oh,
that's from the University of Illinois. Yeah. Good to see you. So, no, David just got me thinking about this as to whether our response to this pandemic would be any different if this were not an election year. Right? I do think there's a fair amount on both sides of a lot of the debate right now about whether we should continue to socially distance, whether we should keep the economy closed, to what extent, how quickly we should open it, I think is getting pretty tied up in ideology right now. Yeah. And that's probably exacerbated a bit by the fact that we've got an election coming up in the U.S. in not too distant future here.
No, you're absolutely right. And what a mindset to start considering some of these factors of how it's not just going to impact us, but how it's impacting the campaigns. I mean, people can campaign on anything right now, right? It's like, but the biggest solution is going to be what? Getting us out of this problem. Somebody made a joke. I think it was actually one of Trump's children. Yeah, we'll have a miracle vaccine the day after the elections. It's like, that's not a joke.
We never have a vaccine. We don't have a vaccine for AIDS.
No, we don't.
It's endemic. We have treatments for it that have radically reduced the spread of it. And this idea that we're going to have a vaccine in 12 months, maybe if we can do things faster, that's terrific. But more likely, we will have effective treatments for it over a period of time.
And I'm glad you brought up that we consider all the other viruses in the world that maybe we never found a cure for, like Ebola, AIDS, that again, we not only don't have a true answer, vaccine or treatment for preventive, but what we have are policies that go with them, right?
These new viruses, well, they're not new, but as the permafrost in Siberia and northern Norway is melting in Canada, they're finding all of these ancient viruses that human beings haven't had any contact with. The Arctic is now teeming with them, according to Scientific American. And we're going to have continual problems with pernicious viruses going forward, especially because there are almost 8 billion of us.
Right. I mean, and then that's something to think about too. There's 8 billion of us, but probably only 500,000 that lead us. Kind of scary. But,
I would like to understand from our panelists that smaller economies and smaller countries have done really well in terms of fighting and managing the COVID-19 situation, be it Hong Kong, be it Macau, be it South Korea, be it Singapore, or be it... So do you think that people have, or countries with limited resources, they are doing good job as compared to countries with so many dollars? Because this is not happening. This is not solving the problem. The problem is solving by people and doctors and pandemic teams and doing the right things on day-to-day basis, and not talking politically, conferences and things like that. And the best part is that a lot of countries, small countries, they are sharing or they are learning from what happened to the bigger countries, and they're implementing it. But countries like Brazil, Russia, and all those things, we have seen that the cases have grown in last maybe a month or so. And they're watching Italy, Spain, US, India, and all those countries, but still they're not learning. So I think that countries with limited resources, they are in a good shape as compared to bigger economy. What do you think, sir?
I feel like in 2 or 3 years, looking back, we're going to learn a lot about what we should have done, right?
Yeah.
Some of these things, it's kind of the nature of science and research and economics as a science and so forth that, you can learn an enormous amount. And there's researchers all over the world that not just the medical researchers in the vaccine, but people trying to understand the impact of social interaction on the spread and all of these things, right? Social scientists as well. And the problem is we can't produce that body of knowledge quite quickly enough to optimize the policies, even if people are listening. And we're certainly living in an era where if anyone is listening to the science is a little more questionable than it sometimes is. But, the truth is, I think, we know a lot more now than we did 2 or 3 months ago, but there's still so much that we don't know, right?
Yeah.
We still don't have a great understanding of exactly the ways that this spreads. One of the questions that I'm really interested in as an economist is we will look back on this someday, and eventually people are going to have some models that are going to allow us to calculate sort of the cost per life saved of the approaches that we use. And it'll be really interesting to see how that compares across countries, as well as the other risks that we obviously pay to reduce. And Did we, expose, did we spend too much or too little on this? I think the jury's out on a lot of these things.
Well, I think, everybody's fighting right now, which is part of, the stages of trauma, right? When you have something horrible that happens to you, there are 5 stages of trauma that you naturally go through, right? Some people go through it faster than others. And I don't think that they prepared the country for this very well, that we are going to have that questioning, we're going to have that anger, we're going to have that doubt, we're going to, and all of this has to happen in order for us to do what? To regain trust and to rebuild, right? So I think, again, this reset button, I hope that it resets to the way we think about our education process, how we can better educate ourselves for the future. And like you said, to maybe be more proactive on our economic foundation, right? To be less lazy about thinking about it, but planning. You can't plan. I guess you can now. You can plan for a pandemic now, like you said.
Well, actually, we can plan for those. I studied. It was one lecture, but when I was in college in the late '60s, early '70s, there was a lecture about we're going to have another pandemic, and how to think about it and how to prepare for it. And we've had a series of pandemics. We had since the 1917, 1921, we had the Eisenhower era flu. We had MERS, which is still around. It has stayed in the Middle East. We have SARS, which is apparently pretty much vanished, but isn't gone in the sense that the virus is completely gone. We had the swine flu, which clearly, shook up Obama, a man who was very deeply into getting science memos. He would get 2-page memos and say, why is this a 2-page memo? I need like 16 pages on this. And he would stay up all night reading these things. But it clearly shook him up. And we need to do more of this fundamental thinking about predictable events and how to prepare for them. And that includes things like volcanic explosions and tsunamis. We now have buoy systems all over the world. Whether they've been economically efficient and effective is another question. I don't think we know that yet, but we certainly have the warning systems. And we're going to have volcanoes and earthquakes and disasters like the pandemic. And we need to be thinking more and spending more money on developing our knowledge base and our capacity to respond quickly when these things arise. And that includes having managers who are expert in this.
I agree with you. And I guess, we got to spend money on a lot of different things. But one of the things that I guess has concerned me, and maybe even the past 2 or 3 years, because like you said, we've seen the coronavirus keep popping its head up over the years, and we've yet to continue funding the resources that it needs to maybe stop it. But for some reason, we put all this money into space, right? Millions and billions of dollars into space that we could be putting back into taking care of our Earth first, right? And don't get me wrong, there's nothing better for me to sit down when I'm really bored and watch some of what's going on in the space and the new photos coming out. Those are cool. But right now, I wish we would take all of that money and concentrate it into how we can make our society better.
Kimberly, a lot of that space spending, though, benefits us directly.
It does.
The Europeans have much better weather forecasting. You want to know where hurricanes are going in the U.S., don't pay attention to ours. Pay attention to the Europeans.
I would only. Oh, go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, there are a number of things that we've learned about our planet from space research. This is a minor point, but rogue waves are real. They're not something made up by crazy sailors who survived. Jeff, somebody wrote a very good piece in one of the science mags I take on the tracking capacity and accuracy of the Europeans versus the Americans on hurricanes coming to the U.S. And it was really quite dramatic how much better they are, because they have put a lot more money into this science, especially into the mathematical modeling, because there's so many data points when you're looking at a hurricane.
I was just going to reframe Kimberly's point a little bit and say, I'd rather not have to choose between taking a little bit of money we spend on this kind of science and spend it over here on this kind of science, instead of saying there's a lot of things we spend money on federal government that would be better used spent on science of all kinds, whether it's space science and physics and astronomy, or whether it's health and studying pandemics. The spending money on sort of fundamental science is the ultimate public good in the way economists think about it. It is something that it's underprovided by the private market. It benefits everyone when we learn from it, and it's hard to sort of exclude people from that knowledge once it exists. And so it meets all these definitions, and it suggests it's something that very much ought to be funded in a big way by the public sector. And there's some hope that this will be a bit of a wake-up call around that. But again, I'd rather, there's lots of other policies I'd rather spend less money on and fund space as well as pandemics, rather than stealing from one to pay the other.
Jeff, I agree with you about that. And I would fundamentally argue the way we need to change our debate is from worrying about today and thinking more about tomorrow. One of my trademark lines is that if you listen carefully to the Republican tax policies, their argument is that we don't have enough investment in America because the rich don't have enough and they're not willing to invest, therefore, so we need to get money to them. And the way to do that has been cutting social safety net, things like that. But the other way to look at it is we're focused way too much on, do you have enough today, rather than, will we have enough tomorrow? And if we think more about beyond my lifespan, which if I'm lucky is 20 years to go, if I'm very lucky, we need to think more about 25 years out and 50 years out and where we want to be, and less about where we're going to be in the next 90 days. I'm a big critic of the 90-day mentality that we've put into our business world. You look at the privately owned businesses in America, Wegmans, which is based here where I live in Rochester, New York, which is privately owned, and how they expand and grow and create wealth rather than creating momentary money through manipulating things and not building up an underlying asset base that keeps producing wealth.
Yeah, there's no question. We've got a problem with short-termism, both in the public and the private sectors. It's certainly true in the U.S., and I think it's true in a lot of other countries around the world. I mean, the psychology literature shows there's two kind of decisions that people really struggle with. One is decisions that are far off in the future, and the other is decisions in which there's a lot of uncertainty. And all the big decisions that we're facing right now, whether it's the solvency of entitlement programs, whether it's climate change, whether it's how we prepare for pandemics, incorporate both of those. You need to take a long-term view, and it's highly uncertain. And we as a society, as well as individuals, just have a really hard time dealing with those kind of questions. And as much as I love the U.S. system of government and our democracy and so forth, we're not particularly good at doing long-term planning. I mean, I think long-term means 2 years in federal government. And from a budget standpoint, sometimes they look out 10 and then they play games with what's outside of the 10.
Well, they're budgeting bothers me as well, because they're not the best budgeting people in the world, and their habits kind of rolled over into the corporate industry, which should have never happened. And their philosophy of, if you don't use it, you lose it. And if you use a little bit more, you get a bigger budget every year. Truly, I think, ruined a lot of corporate America. Because they started taking on that philosophy and then spending more money on useless things that they didn't need to do just to meet a budget or get more money. So I think their practices need to be reset as well. If you look at their budget system, it's
I've got to get off because I have a radio show to do, but I want to leave you with one thought to think about. Maybe we'll take it up next week.
Absolutely.
The word entitlements. If you're entitled under tax law to defer paying taxes for 30 or 40 years, and I've revealed a lot of the devices to let you do that, that's an entitlement just like Social Security. And we should think about entitlements broadly, not in the political sense, but at the economic sense. If we look at entitlements as an economic issue, not a political issue, you come to much different observations about what's an entitlement.
So just for the record, David, I'm just going to say I didn't use that term in a pejorative sense. I used it
I didn't think you did
in
at
the
all.
technical sense of the benefits that people get are based on a formula, not based on annual legislation.
I agree with you about that, and I understood what you were doing, but I wanted on this show to bring up this. Let's have a talk about entitlement.
He's giving me a reminder. This is what we're going to talk about next week.
I'd like to propose to you something for you to think and discuss it next week on Monday.
Yeah, would be a good thing. I got to get off. I'm sorry.
All right, take care.
Okay, I'll talk to you then. Basically, what I wanted to offer is, I think I talked about it on one of the programs last week, maybe. As something what we were talking about investment in space and in sciences and everything else, believe it, who did excellent job was Russia. In right after Second World War, they were obviously a superpower, and they were competing with the United States everywhere, in space, in military spending, in rockets, in nuclear arms race, and everything. And you know how they did it? They had concentration camps. Well, all the scientists who invented all these nuclear arms and ballistic rockets and so on, they were all working in concentration camps. Okay, they had very good conditions there. They had enough food supply, and they could attend all kind of conveniences there. But it was a concentration camps. And you know what? When Russia started to falter, in fact, in Gorbachev's time, they started to dismantle concentration camps. And that's where Russia started to go apart. So the best model for a country like Russia, I'm not suggesting it for the United States, God forbid, or Brazil or anybody else, but specifically for Russia, the best system was a system of concentration camps. By the way, the only other country which did quite well was Germany in the 30s and the wartime. The problem is, the only differences between Germany and Russia was the Germans for building concentration camps for other nations like Jews, Poles, Slavs, Hungarians, and Russia built them for their own people. That's the only difference.
That's interesting.
It's about the same.
I read a story on that just recently, so I'm glad you brought that up, because I'm going to go back and reread that story because it was very, very interesting. But what I want to talk about too is, what are some of the new curriculums that you see that might be coming out of what happened here? Some new directions that the educational system and universities might be focusing on?
Sure, happy to talk about that. Although I just want to say in response that those of us who care deeply about individual freedom and individual liberty are willing to perhaps take a bit less scientific progress if the only way you could get it is to it's the way that Alexander indicated. That's a pretty rough approach. As far as curriculum, I think when I think about it from a business school perspective, I think what we've seen here is going to elevate enormously all the principles around risk management as a field. Wow. Right? We talk a lot about risk management from a financial perspective oftentimes, but risk management is really much broader than that, right? And I think it's more than just an insurance industry or what have you. It's all the risks that any enterprise, public or private or not-for-profit, faces. And those can be health related, they can be economic and financial market related. They can also be things like cybersecurity. They can be issues around privacy and so forth. And if you look across the world at a lot of the issues that have been problematic over the last couple of years, they've all got a dimension of how do you manage risk. And one of the interesting things is, almost by definition, risk management done really effectively is very interdisciplinary, right? It requires, technical knowledge, whether it's about how viruses work, or whether it's about how financial derivatives work, or how climate science works. But it also requires, strategic thinking and leadership and communication and all of those things. So I think a lot of curriculum is going to refocus around that point.
So you know what, one of the things that I hope comes out of it in the risk management is to do a lot more what ifs, right? I see a lot of risk management evolving in the past few years, and sometimes we take a lot of shortcuts and we don't ask enough what ifs. And especially in cybersecurity, which is some of my background, telecom, engineering, and we had to do a lot of road mapping those what ifs. And I think there needs to be more road mapping and planning. But I think you're right. I think risk management is definitely needed in this day and time, but not just for the economic foundation of what kind of insurance do we need. It's more for the preventive scale. So.
And also I completely agree. And when we think about training students, I think what this episode also demonstrates is that, we should have known there was a high risk that a pandemic was going to hit sometime during our lifetime, right? That David was talking about before he left. But the way we responded to this and the idea of shutting down the economy, that wasn't on anybody's radar screen even 4 months ago, right? So in terms of training our students, we've written in future business leaders, they've got to be able to think on their feet and be very agile in their approaches and be very resilient. Those are sort of fundamental skills for anyone that wants to be successful as a business leader going forward. And, those things can be taught. They can be taught through a mixture of classroom as well as what we call experiential learning that we try to expose our students to, where they're working with real clients on real problems, doing simulations, things like that. And I think we're desperately going to need much, much more of that in pretty much any field.
One of the best things that ever happened in my career, and it was very exhausting, but when I was very, very young in my career, I worked with the Special League of Engineers. We traveled all over the United States. But we had network switches, right? They could not be down 3 minutes because, a whole city could go down, right? So there's several things we learned in engineering. You always have a full, this kind of system, right? Always have a full redundant system. Always test your redundant system, right? Don't let it go months without knowing that. But knowing that I had 3 minutes to get something back up, where you're talking about reacting real quick on your feet, that trained me so much. Right, because we were told lives depend on that network switch, right? Everything in the city relied on that. The EMTs, everything. So we had a 3-minute return time, or it could be our job. And I liked my job. So, but it trained me. It trained me to think harder, faster, always stay ahead. Oh, I knew that switch inside and out. I knew it better than the people who designed it, because I would see the mistakes that happen whenever we go out. And it teaches you how to ask better questions.
Absolutely.
And so the training, I think you're right. I think if you could throw your students into some real life situations where they have to get something done in a quick amount of time is the best way to do this.
Yeah, so one of the things we've done at Gies is we now require every student, undergrad and grad student, to go through what we call an experiential learning course or program, where what we mean by that is a wide range of things. But at the core, they work in teams to work on real problems for real life clients. Those clients could be anywhere from, a Fortune 500 company to a local startup to a not-for-profit to a university. But they're forced into the situation, and often it's an interdisciplinary team, and they've got to figure out, as you pointed out, what are the right questions to ask to make sure I understand what the client's looking for, to deal with the unexpected, to learn how to communicate effectively, to learn how to operate in a group. Those are skills that, like we all know, are incredibly important in business, but they're hard to teach through only a traditional classroom environment. But what we teach in the classroom is really important. So giving these things together in the curriculum is incredibly valuable.
Well, and that's awesome that you're letting them work on real life situations. And I wish we would have had that. I got thrown into the fire. But you're right, knowledge. If you don't have the knowledge of how the product was engineered or the knowledge of how economics was pulled together, you're not going to be able to react quick. You're not. So, Ankit.
So, Jeff, what do you think about global exposure? Because people who do, or students who want to do their MBAs from international universities, maybe US, UK, somewhere else, they look for that global class and the global exposure, because they must have done their trainings and job for maybe 8-10 years of experience of working in different countries in different companies. So how important is the global exposure? Because the second part of the question is that when you do an online MBA, you just meet people like the way we are talking. So how can we set up that global exposure? Because right now we are in a global world, and whatever you do in India, it can impact to US or any other country.
Absolutely. I mean,
That's a good
there's
idea.
a million examples of the importance of global exposure, not least of which is the situation we find ourselves in right now, where some virus appears in a market or whatever the source was in Wuhan, and the next thing you know, the whole world is closed. So we agree completely. So at the undergraduate level, we very strongly encourage study abroad. Something like 60% of our undergraduate students do end up with a study abroad experience sometime before they graduate. At the graduate level, especially in our MBA program, and when we have students from all over the world, and we try to structure the conversations and the classes and so forth to really leverage that fact. So when people are in groups, actually one of the biggest challenges they have to figure out right away is, when are they going to get together virtually as a study group when they have some, kind of like you guys, we have somebody in Asia and somebody in the US and somebody in India and all over the world. But they do learn to work very effectively together. And you can, a lot of the cultural in skills that one needs to develop, believe it or not, they actually can be done just by working with people, even if it's done virtually. Now, before the pandemic started, we also offered we call immersion experiences for our online graduate students, where we would say, hey, we're going to take 40 people to Germany, or we're going to take 40 people to Brazil or to China or what have you. And we'd spend a few days taking a deep dive in a particular industry on a particular problem in a particular country. And we'd have people flying from all over the world to do it. So I 100% agree with you. And the world has never been more globally integrated than it is today.
Well, and I think it's just going to continue. Go ahead.
Do you suggest students who want to be an entrepreneur, they should go for a program on a business school, or is it for people who wanted to get employee under a big company? Because there are two different.
So we have, like in our program, we have all kinds, right? So we definitely have entrepreneurs in the program, but we also have people representing, I think something like 2/3 of the Fortune 500. Wow. So as well as doctors and lawyers and everything else. It's we view the program as teaching a fundamental set of skills, right? So we're going to teach you to think strategically, and we're going to make you understand finance and how to read financial statements. We're going to understand the principles of marketing and teamwork. We're going to teach leadership, creativity, and all those things. And frankly, all those skills are enormously valuable, whether you decide you want to go start your own tech company or your own, music business, or whether you want to go back and apply those skills for a large company for whom you work. One of the things that we really love about having in our MBA program, the online MBA program, with these very experienced professionals, is they'll learn something in a class on Thursday, and they'll send an email to the professor, a couple of days later, and go, hey, that concept that we talked about today, I was able to apply that in a meeting on Monday morning, and it had an immediate payoff, right? So we think we serve both well.
And how important is the language and communication in these programs? Because people are coming from different diversities, different cultures, different demographics, and they come and discussing about their own best practices, businesses and skills and things like that. But the communication and language is always important in terms of doing the right business globally. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so there are two ways to interpret what you mean by language. So I'll ask you to clarify. Do you really mean, like, are they speaking English or something else, or do you mean kind of the terminology that they're using to describe certain phenomena?
Both the things. Both the things. English as a language and also the terminology. Yeah,
so our courses are in English. There's a really interesting question, though, that I've been thinking about for the last year or two, because we talked last time about the fact that this MBA program, it's affordable, it's accessible anywhere in the world. But there's a lot of people that don't have the English skills to meet sort of the standard university requirement. And I keep thinking, we're not that far from that being a total anachronism, because the technology already exists to do simultaneous translation, right?
Yeah.
And so our university, like a lot of universities, sort of has this view, understandable, that if you're going to have a degree from Illinois, you ought to be proficient in English. And so we test for that on the way in. But like, I'm beginning to wonder if that's really going to even be a relevant consideration in a couple of years, because I could, I put in an earbud and I have on my phone and I can go somewhere and have a conversation and have this automatic translation. That may obviate the need for language testing in the not too distant future. But in the meantime, our courses are taught in English, and people do have to have some basic English proficiency in order to.
Star Wars has definitely come about in that translation world,
It's a great analogy.
I was at the World Leaders Conference 2 years ago, the first time I've seen it on movies and stuff, but actually to experience it, I was at the World's Leaders Conference, and you tell them what English, what language you are and what room you're going to walk into, and you get the headset, right? And it automatically, whatever language they're speaking on the stand, it translates for you. And if you have a question, it reverts the it was beautiful. It was a time that I just to experience was different. But you're right, we're already there. We're on that top of the fence. When we can start executing it, it's very expensive, but I think the more we start using it and try to deploy it, you could probably start deploying it in your classes.
And I don't know if it's going to be 2 years or 5 years or 10 years, but as with most of these things, when they first come out, they don't work perfectly and they're expensive, as you say. But the need for this is huge. The benefits from this are huge, and I can very easily see that over the next couple of years, the cost is going to come down as the quality goes up. And I fully expect that by the time I retire, I'm going to be able to travel the world and go anywhere, not have to worry about speaking the language, as long as I've got an earbud and a phone.
Or transferring your currency. You're not going to have to worry about any of that, because all of that's going to be on a blockchain format. And so again, I was so blown away when I put the headsets on, and so it is here. I think it's time to maybe start, looking and maybe implementing it into the education system. I would have never thought of that until our conversation today, actually.
No, it's something I'm actually quite interested in. It's one of those things that's hard to get people to really wrap their mind around and think about. If you've had for 100 years, basic requirements, or if you have a university-wide requirement that they have to have a minimum score on the test of English as a foreign language, those sorts of things. Those policies existed for very good reasons historically, but like, we need to start talking now about whether those policies are going to be relevant a couple of years down the road. I mean, it's really
think about the brain set that you could get in if you eliminated the communication problem, right? The brain powers.
There's brilliant people all over the world, and not all of them speak English.
Exactly.
Right?
You've just broadened your brain power by 100 times, if not more, but you broaden your options to bring them in. And it's just purely by getting rid of the communications barrier, because one of the biggest problems in anything is communications, right?
You bet.
So, and I think the big part of the educational part of this would be, in implementing this into your school or anything, is it understanding that you've translated properly, but you've educated the person to understand the definitions of your tools, right? Sure. So like, if you're talking about the definition of engineering, right? And you want to talk about LAPD, that when it's translated, they understand what you're talking about in LAPD. So just those kind of things, right? That they understand the terminologies. So I think it can be done. I think it's time.
Technology is definitely our friend on this. So go ahead, Ankit.
Technologies is available. There are a lot of things available, but we are not utilizing our resources to the fullest. And that is what we are lacking in terms of COVID as well. We have a lot of things to share around the world, the best practice, but we are not doing it because we are not thinking like a global world. We are still thinking like individual countries. And then there's a lot of politicization and things like that. And that's why we are not able to, come over it. It's been like 5-6 months since the COVID happened in China. but still we are not sure what to do because we are not sharing the right information with each other, and we are struggling individually. But if we do everything in a group, it would be great, and that's where we require a lot of people who understand the technology, understand the blockchain, who understand the management and how to operate into the world. And also, Professor Jeff, we are surprised that we don't have a pandemic world association or an organization which manages the world pandemic. We have WHO, we have United Nations, but we don't have a pandemic world organization.
Yeah, one of the things that I've found myself wondering about recently is whether, when we're through all of this, whatever that means, whether it's going to accelerate or decelerate the extent of globalization and integration, right? Because on the one hand, we've all learned how interdependent we are, and the value of sharing information and sharing knowledge across countries and so forth. On the other hand, we were already in a period of sort of growing nationalism in a lot of countries, including the US. And I think this may accelerate some of that because there is a part of the debate, a part of the discussion where people are reacting to this by saying, we just want to close our borders and sort of not let the rest of the world in, which is, of course, not realistic, but it can lead to more isolationist policy. I mean, for example, President Trump, it's been written in a number of articles just in the last week, appears to be considering eliminating the optional professional training that comes along with a student visa for international students to study in the U.S. I think this is bad for the tech sector. It's certainly bad for higher education, and it's bad for the students that want to come here to study. But that is a direct reaction to the combination of the pandemic and the growing nationalist feeling that's out there. I don't have a crystal ball, or if I do, it's in 1,000 pieces right now because the world has changed so much in the last couple of months. But it's a big open question in my mind.
Well, and this hit us harder than any other scenario that has ever been predicted. Warren Buffett thought that cyber war was going to truly destroy us. And you had other people predict various other things, just regular war. But this really took down the world, not a country.
You bet it did.
And but we were talking earlier too. What I've noticed is I'm kind of taking a step back. Like you said, my crystal ball is kind of broken too, and I'm kind of taking a step back because I'm an entrepreneur at different levels, and I'm looking at the different countries, right? And I'm looking at how they dealt with it, and how they're like you said, we can go back and go, oh yeah, that's how I would do it. But how they're still dealing with it because they don't know all the answers, who's taking all the extra precautions. But what I noticed was the countries that were humbled out of this versus the countries who still are not humbled. And that's what has really just awakened me, is the humbleness that I have seen in different countries, how they kind of really kind of came inward and then rebuilt. But, certain countries didn't humble out of this, like Russia. I do not see any humbleness in Russia. I do not see any humbleness in China. There's a loss of empathy in many, many ways. And I didn't see any humbleness in the U.S. And, because we're still living about like, oh, it doesn't matter. I'm not going to live my life in fear. Well, you might not live, but because everybody puts me down right now because I'm refusing to travel to certain events in June. I'm just not going to, because one, I have what I consider a compromised immune system because of a very rare spinal disease. I don't want to put my life or my family's life at risk any more than what I have to. We don't know where this is going to go in 2 to 3 months just because we re-entered. But everyone has got this attitude of, oh, you're living your life in fear. You're never And I just think the attitude of people just need to become a little more humbled if we're going to survive not just this, but survive the next one, because there will be another one.
Of course, yeah. Unfortunately, there will be, and let's hope that it's many years away. But the risk is always there. Look, I mean, this is a really tough period for everyone, right? We all understand why we did what we did, right? At the same time, we also need to acknowledge that came at enormous cost. right? And it's not, I get tired of the old, dollars versus lives. No, it's not, right? I mean, when you shut down an economy and you're throwing people out of work and you're throwing them into difficult economic circumstances, we know that over time that's also going to have a negative impact on mortality and health. So it's about balancing these things, right? And I'm kind of not I tend to not be an extremist on anything other than I'm an extreme centrist on most issues.
There you go.
And to me, it's just it's all about trade-offs, right? It's all about understanding that there are costs associated that we need to recognize of trying to prevent the spread of this disease. And at some point, we just have to decide how much is worth it. And, we've imposed probably trillions of dollars of global costs right now. My guess is there's going to be a ton of studies that come out of this. Even if you only look at mortality as the outcome, you're going to have some causes of mortality are going to go up as a result of this, and some are going to come down. And, again, that's why it's going to take us a few years to really look back and understand, who really did this right in retrospect. Whose crystal ball worked.
And maybe it's not a matter of who did it right, but how to move forward. Right.
Yeah. How to prepare for the next one.
Right. And maybe, and again, I always tell people, you can always rebuild an economy. It's not going to be easy. There are going to be not lives sacrificed, though, hopefully, but there are going to be jobs that were sacrificed, household incomes, and that's not good. But
companies that fail that won't be able to come back, etc.
No, and we talked about it earlier, was that the small businesses, especially the minorities, did not get any of the funding. They did not get any of the funding that was promised. I read the stimulus, and Nick did a show on it with his team of people, but I read it, and I really didn't see that what everybody was talking about, that it's bottom up. And but certainly what came out of it was the especially the small businesses, they may have gotten $1,000, and here's where they got hurt out of it. The stimulus was supposed to give at least a rubber stamp 10K to everyone. It was just, that's what it was intended to do, and it didn't happen. And then they made up a new rule and said, well, we're going to give you just a little bit of money per employee, right, that you show, which is not going to give you enough money to sustain. But they wrote a rule in there that if you got any money, then you didn't qualify for any of the other loans. So if they gave you $1,000, then I can't go apply for the other emergency assistance fund. So that's where they truly hurt the small businesses that they did give money to, because they only gave them $1,000 instead of the $10,000, and then they eliminated their ability to apply for another loan. So,
well, going back to the point we were talking about earlier in the show around just being prepared and having a playbook, right?
That's important.
Part of the playbook has to think about these policies ahead of time, because when you're trying to throw policies together in the moment, there's always unintended consequences. There are always policy A conflicts with policy B, or you create some bizarre incentive, or you end up penalizing a group you didn't intend to. And that's why really taking the time to map these things out in advance so that you know what tools you have available is really, really important.
And you know what?
There should be a learning of how to get fail and then how to come back after that failure. Because if you can come back, and during this pandemic also, you know how to come back and how to live or maybe restart your business or life after the pandemic, or maybe something happened to you. And that should be one of the classes in business school as well, because business can fall down. Maybe because of bankruptcy, but because of a lot of other factors as well. A lot of people have closed their businesses during the pandemic. But now, if they know how to restart or reboot it, that's what we need to train, and we need to tell people, because today is COVID, tomorrow may be something else. So we need to be ready with how we can, get back to work and get back to life and get back to normalcy.
No, there's no question that resilience is incredibly important, both at an individual level and in terms of companies. It's hard to do, though, if a small business person doesn't have the liquidity or had their wealth wiped out, right? And a big focus of all of this should have been around providing that liquidity to really to the whole economy, but especially to small businesses. And, you know, I think it's just not going to be enough for many of them, unfortunately.
Well, it's not. I wish that they would take a look at an overall forgiveness to the people who do have money, that if they come in and invest in the small businesses, that they maybe get a huge tax break and there's no cap on it, just to get this rolling again, because it's truly the small businesses that build our economy. You know, everyone thinks it's the big corporations, but I truly think that it's the small businesses that keep our communities built up, keeps the money circulating. And, you know, everybody has their idea. I mean, there's a room for, you know, there's a place for big corporations. And you know, but the small businesses, they shouldn't be suffering like this through this time. Like you said, if we had a better playbook, maybe I'm going to check out that game. I would like to see, I don't know about you guys, I'm not going to check it out, but I'm going to send a copy to Trump. But and to just say, hey, let's play this game a little bit. You know, it might be worth it to have, because, you know, game playing, role playing, game playing, that's a good way to learn how to do things. Like I loved all kinds of money board games of money. Monopoly was one of my favorites.
Oh, yeah.
You know, taught you how to keep a bank of money. So just those kind of things, I think we're going to have to, in the future, build those into our educational system. How are things going there in Illinois?
Well, so that's a big question, right?
It's not loaded, I promise. It's not.
This being Memorial Day weekend, I mean, people are, I think, really for the first time, people are starting to get out a bit more. You know, the governor has a phased reentry in place, and he's done it by regions of the state, recognizing that, you know, Chicago is very different than, say, Southern Illinois. At the university, we have not made any announcements yet about the fall, other than we're going to do everything we can to get students back on campus. But, you know, we've got to meet certain health criteria and get testing in place and all of that. So, I mean, it's still a very odd situation. I mean, we're all still mainly at home. Most restaurants that are still in business are primarily doing takeout at this point. And you know, back to your point around helping out small businesses. I mean, the thing we really need to do to help small businesses is get demand back again. We need to help people to actually buy their goods and services. And so we've got to figure out how to do that in a way that keeps people safe, right? And that's why many of us have been so vocal about the need for testing, as well as the need for, you know, wearing masks and social distancing, right? The testing, if we can't do testing, and this COVID is such an unusual disease in the sense that so many people are asymptomatic. And so you can't just go by, oh, they're not feeling well, stay at home. There's a lot of people that have it that are feeling fine. And that's why we need people to engage in some of these social distancing matters. And I was a little alarmed over the weekend in my social media feed to see how many people are like, you know what, if you're not feeling well, you stay home. If you're not comfortable going out, don't go out. But don't tell me what to do. And I'm like, Dan, the point is, you might have it and not know it, and you're going to infect the person who actually has an underlying health condition, right? So,
well, what about the stylist that infected 84 people? And how many? And then if you take those 84 people, because
and then they infect others.
2 week span, and but you got a point there. I will say this, you know, given that Iceland had done such a good job, and they are a small population, right? A university is a small population, kind of the same footprint, very cozy, right? Maybe that's something to look at to see, because again, their testing mechanism was totally different than what anyone else did in the world. And like you said, and I'm going to share a story with you. We have a doctor that comes on our show quite often. He's one of the local ones actually here. And he tested a lot of people positive. He's been working frontline. And he tested a patient positive the other day in his small town. And he, you know, gave them the directive that they were supposed to have: go home, stay home. We'll keep up with you, treatments, you know. And in North Carolina, you have to sign a promise that you're going to self-quarantine. So he goes to the store later that night or the next day, and he's, you know, the doctor's got his mask on, his goggles, right, doing all the right things, and he walking around the store. And we have this attitude in North Carolina, you don't have to wear a mask if you don't want to. And there was his patient in the store with no mask.
Tested positive. Yeah.
No mask. And how do you think they made the doctor feel?
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
I just treated you probably for free, and you just now infected the whole community. And he was heartbroken because it's a very small community where he lives, and two people, they were very proud because nobody had died yet, right? But they had just experienced 2 deaths in the same week, and one was a very young person. So everything that everyone thought this was in the very beginning, that's been put out the door. Like you said, we don't really know, but I believe in the testing. I really do. And you know what? You can get the test kits so inexpensive. That's one of the businesses I'm doing is, and I've learned the cost of these test kits at a wholesale price. There was no reason why we shouldn't have sent one to everyone instead of a stimulus package and said, here, a whole box for 30 days, test every day and then go to work. And if you test positive, go to the PCR test. It's like a home pregnancy test, right? It's going to be about 85% right. So if you test positive, go to the next stage and get tested again. But it's what they call screening. It's a screening. And
we've got, like here in Illinois, some of our faculty at the university have put together a really good model to sort of forecast, say, a week or 2 out where the hot spots are in the state, like down to the county or zip code level. And they were doing this precisely to figure out where should we put resources for testing locations, right? Because if you know that a area is starting to have an outbreak, that's exactly, if you don't have enough tests, I'd love it if we could just send tests to everybody, right? But if you can't do that, you want to get them to the right places at the right time. And we've now got the capability to sort of do some prediction about where we're going to see cases. And man, if we can get tests to those places, we can make a big difference. And that then allows more people to start getting out, because we've got small towns and communities that really haven't been all that affected by it, and yet they're shut down too. Maybe we can let them get back to work if we've got the testing in place.
Well, the capability of getting the testing out there like that is available. It is available. It's just not being made available, and it's very cost effective if it's bought at wholesale. But what I learned is from the price of the manufacturer to the doctor, it has like 3,000 times. 3,000 times. So they made it very cost affordable. Somewhere there's a middleman there, mostly government, getting all the money from it. And
what we can do is we should have a mobile ATMs or test ATMs basically available.
Mobile ATM.
Great idea.
With more, people with So we can track through a mobile phone or a GPS, and you can test everyone maybe in a couple of days, and then you can roam that an ambulance or whatever it is, to some other place, and that can be done. I don't know. See, we have done a lot of things in different ways, not in healthcare, but in other areas. We are not utilizing the resources. That's what I told you. Everyone has a car, everyone has this motor and all those things, and we have money as well. We are just not utilizing it the right way. And politicians might be testing from morning to evening. They have to test every day about themselves, about their staff, but they're not doing the right thing for the human beings and people around.
Yeah, you would have thought with several $1 trillion of stimulus money, we could have found enough money to buy some test kits. But
well, at the price of the test kits, we could have bought enough for every person in the country to test for 30 days. I already did the numbers. So at that amount of money, we could have kept people at work just by testing, just like Iceland did. Iceland that's all they did was keep testing people to keep them working. The problem is you have to order it, right? And nobody wanted to order it. But if you go ahead and order it, it's there. Again, a product like that ramps up based on orders. So there's no problem ramping up the manufacturing of something like that. You just have to place the orders. So I'm just saying it's something to think about as a dean of a university, to consider these things, or, somebody you've got a small community that you could really make.
No, you're exactly right. So we've got we have 50,000 students on campus. We have another several thousand faculty and staff, and then we're part of a community that has 150,000 residents. So it's a decent size, but we've got a task force working really hard right now to figure out how we're going to do testing, how we're going to do tracking when somebody does test positive, to track their social network, right? And by the way, there's some cool technology out there. So I was talking to somebody in Australia the other day, and they have a thing that on everybody's cell phone, if you're in, I don't remember the exact parameters, but say within 6 feet of somebody for 5 or 10 minutes, it essentially captures that information. And if you test positive, they then get an alert. It just happens automatically, right? If we can make use of testing and that kind of technology to map down the networks and then have a set of protocols in place, the hope is we can be back and we can be educating students again and all observe social distancing. And
have you talked to the person who created that technology? If you did, if you could send me that information, I would appreciate it.
So the person I talked to isn't the one that did it. There's somebody who I'm on a board with who is in Australia, but I can find out the name of it.
I would love to speak with them very much. Thank you. Yes.
Jeff, I can ask you a very quick question. A few months ago, I saw Warren Buffett on CNBC, and somebody asked him a question: with increasing of annual debt of the U.S. government, could U.S. go eventually bankrupt because of inability to serve the debt? And his reply was, how a country, the only one country in the world which has the ability to print U.S. dollars, can go bankrupt. It's just impossible. Okay, if he is right, and most of the times Warren Buffett is right rather than wrong, let me ask you this. In the last 3 years, U.S. debt, since Trump came to power, the U.S. debt increased from $17 trillion to 25. Now, with all the talking about all the kind of projects, the road repairs and infrastructure and everything else, most likely either Trump or somebody else will increase the deficit to, say, $35 trillion. So this is really in cards. If you could go in 3 years from 17 to 25, so nothing can prevent you going from 25 to 35. So how that will affect everything what we are living in U.S., how it will affect the life of U.S. citizens?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and I will tell you that the macroeconomic community is having a pretty lively debate over these topics even before this current pandemic. Because if you go back a dozen years ago, the Great Recession and the financial crisis, we poured a lot of money in at that time, and a lot of people, including myself, thought that would have led to inflation by today, right? The real risk of there are two big risks that come with that kind of spending. If you're putting too much money into the system, you risk inflation, and if you are running up too much debt, the concern is about a credit crisis. That if at some point the creditors begin to doubt your ability to make good on that, then they can lose confidence in the federal government as a lender.
You print even more money. There's a way to fight debt.
Well, but that's the problem. You've got to believe there's a limit, right? And the problem is we don't know where the limit is, because if you're just printing, let's suppose we printed, $100 quadrillion, right?
Yep, exactly.
We haven't actually changed the productive capacity of the United States. So you've now got all these additional dollars chasing the same goods. What adjusts during that time? Well, suddenly you have massive inflation, right? And so that is the risk. And a lot of us, I think, are puzzled by the fact that we haven't seen inflation take root. And actually, if you look right now at some of the inflation indicators, whether it's you look at the spread on nominal versus inflation index bonds, if you look at inflation expectations of professional economists, those kinds of things, there's not a lot of evidence that this massive debt we've got right now and the increase in the monetary easing that we've had in response to this has led to a lot of inflation fear. So that suggests we probably can do a little bit more. But I think if we're going to do it more, we need to do it with the understanding that this game cannot go on forever. And what frustrates me is during the good times is when we ought to be showing some fiscal discipline. So we've got dry powder at times like this when we need it. And the problem in the United States is that we're not particularly good about our fiscal discipline even during the good times. So yeah, is 35 trillion the number that would set off a credit crisis? I don't know. Maybe it's 26 trillion. Maybe it's 50 trillion. I don't really want to play that. I don't want to gamble on that is the problem.